morning, everyone. We're just going to wait for a few seconds for folks to actually get into the webinar before we get started. So we'll be on mute here for a few seconds. Okay, it looks like our numbers are getting somewhat stable. So welcome to this webinar we're hosting this morning. This is the compliance workshop for large final emitters and opted-in facilities to tier for the 2020 compliance year. We're going to run through a slide deck this morning. We've set aside a fair amount of time this morning for questions. We understand a lot of folks are new to the tier regulations, so we definitely encourage people not to be shy in terms of asking questions. I guess even folks that have previously been in the CCIR or the SGER, this is a new regulation under tier, so feel free to ask questions throughout the session. Logistically, there is a Q&A function in the webinar tool, so you can type your questions into the Q&A function, and we'll be taking stops as we go this morning to address questions. Okay, so we'll move through to introductions. My name is John Story-Bischoff. I'm Director of Climate Change Compliance in the Climate Implementation and Compliance branch. I'm joined by a couple folks. I've got Maggie from our team, and Jason from the Offsets team are also going to be on the webinar this morning, and so they'll be able to help field questions, and we'll be delivering some of the material this morning also. So we've highlighted a few, I guess, very key takeaways for the session this morning. So these are the most, I guess, high-level kernels that we'd like you to go away with from the session today. So the first of those is that the person responsible is to submit a verified compliance report by June 30th, 2021 for the 2020 compliance year. Also, that required true-up, and that can be fund payments or a mixture of fund payments and credit retirement, needs to be completed before submitting your compliance report, because the compliance report is intended to demonstrate that you're in compliance with the regulation. Also, to highlight that verification firms will be busy this year. We've had a fairly large expansion of the program, so the advice there is to start early and have the compliance report, your quantification methodology documents, calculation worksheets, and other materials that are required for verification ready as you enter into the verification process, and also to contact the department if you're struggling to find a verifier for the work this year. Okay, so in terms of the topics that we'll cover this morning, we're going to go through some introductions and talk a little bit about how our functions are organized within the department. We're going to do some a little bit of background and regulatory overview. So we'll talk a little bit about the tier system and the previous systems that existed in Alberta. I've got a couple of quite brief slides on the specified gas reporting regulation. So that's our combined greenhouse gas reporting regulation, where there's a single window entry with the federal government. I'll go over a little bit prior period results and learnings from past compliance periods that are likely to be applicable again for the 2020 year. We'll go over a little bit obtaining verification, so a little bit of a backgrounder on verification and the facilities, what the facilities should be thinking about in terms of getting a suitable verification for their 2020 compliance report. We're going to spend a little bit of time doing a bit of an overview of the Alberta greenhouse gas quantification methodology. So that methodology under tier was published in draft a number of months ago, and I guess much more recently in final form for 2020. So we'll hit some highlights of that this morning. We'll talk about the methods of true up to make sure you're in compliance with the regulation. And we'll also spend a bit of time going through the compliance reporting form. Okay, our next slide here, we're going to go over a little bit the organization for within the department related to the climate functions. So we have, I guess, the climate implementation and compliance branch under Justin Wheeler. We also have reporting to Justin. We have a number of directors. So Marika Dubé, Barry Anderson, Rob Violetti, Justin Toner, and myself. And we've highlighted here the some of the team members under there that you may interact with. So on the compliance side, in our team, we've got Yan, Shan, James, Gustavo, Maggie, and Patrick. Anna and Lisa are on leave at this time. And we've just been joined by Paul Canna also. In the emissions offset team, we have Lindsay, Amanda, Nana, and Jason. And for the SGRR, we have Scott and normally Shaheen. Shaheen's off on leave, and Arifa will likely be helping out. I might pause for 1 second. I'm getting some notes that some folks are finding this slide is a little small, I understand, but some folks are finding the slides a little blurry. So I'm just going to pause for 1 minute and see if there's something we can do about that. Okay, we'll keep going, and we'll see if that improves. If not, we might have to pause for a little bit. Okay, so the other part of the organization that people are probably pretty familiar with, especially with the engagement work that's going on now, is the Air and Climate Policy team under Rob Hamlick. So on the air side, we have Hamid Naseshi. We also have Heather Carmichael, who people have probably worked with, Director of Strategic Climate Policy. We also have Sam. We also have Sam Ferrillo, who's our Director of Industrial Climate Policy. who people are almost certainly familiar with. And we have Roger Armstrong with a focus on climate adaptation and resource efficiency. Okay, I'll move now to the background and regulatory review portion of the deck this morning. So as I guess many people know, in terms of a little bit of the history here, the Specified Gas Emitters Regulation was the regulation covering industrial greenhouse gas emissions from 2007 to 2017. That program had some similarities to the TIER program. It was based on facility-specific baselines, which looked at historic performance, and it was looking at direct emissions only. So there was no accounting under SGR of electricity brought on site or heat or hydrogen. We transitioned from the Specified Gas Emitters Regulation to the Carbon Competitiveness Incentive Regulation for the 2018-2019 years. So the program under CCIR had, again, it was an output-based allocation system. And there we had a combination of what were called assigned and established benchmarks. And we included the concept of both direct and indirect emissions or imports of electricity, heat, and hydrogen under the CCIR. The Carbon Competitiveness Incentive Regulation, I guess, also had a provincial companion piece that was the provincial carbon levy. And it also had, I guess, from the inception of the CCIR with the carbon levy in place, the ability to opt in to the CCIR program. So we've now transitioned from CCIR to TIER for the 2020 compliance year and forward. So again, the first period that was covered in terms of emissions and production for TIER started January 1st, 2020. The program regulates facilities that have emitted more than 100,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2016 or a subsequent year. And again, there's a couple pathways to voluntarily enter the program. So you can enter as an opted-in facility, so it's an individual site, or smaller conventional oil and gas facilities. Those conventional oil and gas facilities with emissions less than 100,000 tons can bring multiple facilities together as an aggregate and enter TIER as an aggregate. So again, TIER is recognized as a recognized provincial program under the Federal Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act for the 2020 and 2021 compliance years, and we intend, I guess, much longer than that. So again, a little bit of the structure of the TIER program. So facilities under TIER need to comply with the least stringent, or I guess the most generous, of a high performance benchmark or a facility specific benchmark. So high performance benchmarks are set out in the schedule and the regulation. They can also be set out by ministerial order. And I guess we're looking to set some high performance benchmarks through ministerial order for 2020 shortly. There's also no tightening on high performance benchmarks, so they're kind of a fixed reference level. And then we also have the facility specific benchmarks, which are generally set at 90% of historical emissions at the outset of TIER. And then there's a subsequent tightening, and there's also a ramp in for newly operating facilities in terms of the target level. Under TIER, the regulated emissions for large emitters and opted-in facilities includes all direct emissions within the facility boundary, and also accounts for imported heat, hydrogen, and electricity. The direct emissions do not include biomass CO2, so CO2 from the combustion or decomposition of biomass, nor federally levied fuels where you had an exemption certificate in place. So that's just a little bit generally about the scope of tier. We'll get into that in a little bit more detail later on this morning. As well as the regulation, the kind of main references we have for the tier program come in the form of standards. So these standards are basically incorporated into the tier regulation, so that the part 1 is binding. The part 2 of these standards is primarily guidance and is not legally binding in the same sense. So there's 4 of them. There's a standard for developing benchmarks, the standard for completing greenhouse gas compliance and forecasting reports, the standard for validation, verification, and audit, as well as the standard for greenhouse gas emission offset project developers. So also, I guess, referenced through the standard for completing greenhouse gas compliance and forecasting reports is our Alberta quantification methodologies document. So this document sets out the mandatory methods that need to be used to quantify greenhouse gas emissions, and in some cases production for regulated facilities. So it is again, I guess, made mandatory through the part 1 of the standard for completing greenhouse gas compliance and forecasting reports. Okay, in terms of the standards themselves, so we'll give a little brief overview of what you may find in the various standards if you're looking for reference materials under tier. So in the standard for developing benchmarks, we provide the methodologies that were used to develop high performance benchmarks, as well as the framework that we have in place for developing facility specific benchmarks. We talk about how electricity, heat, and hydrogen are treated in the benchmarking process, as well as cogeneration and self-generation of electricity in terms of creating benchmarks. And we also talk a little bit about the processes in terms of entering into the regulation. So that has to do with opting in, the target phase in, and we also cover the cost containment program in that standard. The standard for completing greenhouse gas compliance and forecasting reports is pretty self-explanatory in terms of the title there. So again, it's really those requirements that are specific to compliance reporting and forecasting, and it also, I guess, gives the level requirements for what needs to be used in the quantification methodologies. The standard for validation, verification, and audit. For most folks, the primary focus here is that verification element. The validation and audit pieces really apply primarily to the cost containment program. So again, these are the requirements set out for third-party assurance providers, whether those are validators or verifiers, as well as auditors. And again, the focus here is really around, the primary focus is really around the verification of compliance reports, benchmark applications, and emission offset project reports. And as mentioned, the validation and audit requirements are really speaking to the cost containment program. The standard for greenhouse gas emission offset project developers, again, reasonably self-explanatory, I think. So that's looking at what is required if you wish to create, register, and serialize credits for an offset project. So I'll talk a little bit about the kinds of submissions that that are kind of very current and that we'll talk about a little bit in this session this morning. So again, we've got the annual compliance reports. So to reiterate, the verified annual compliance reports must be submitted by June 30th of 2021 for the 2020 compliance year. And again, kind of normally by June 30th of the year following the compliance period for future years. the verification needs to provide a positive opinion. And so that means that if there's any material mistakes in the compliance reporting, those should get resolved before the compliance report is submitted to the department. Just to be clear, forecasting reports do not need to be verified. And there are differences between the compliance reporting form for large emitters and opted-in facilities versus aggregate facilities. And we'll later in the morning, we'll go through a short overview of the compliance reporting form for 2020 purposes. Okay, a little bit about forecasts. So a forecasting facility under the tier regulation is defined as a site having had emissions over 1 megaton in 2016 or a subsequent year. So the department has required these facilities to submit forecasts, and the reason for that is it's very helpful for our internal forecasting of compliance outcomes and fund payments to know what's happening or what's trending with these very largest of facilities under tier. So again, the forecasting facilities have to submit a forecast for the upcoming year by November 30th, unless the current year is the first year that the site is over 1 megaton, the previous year's emissions were less than 1 megaton, or the previous year's true-up obligation was less than 50,000 tons. Forecasting facilities also need to submit an update to their forecast by March 31st, covering the prior year compliance period. So in this case, for this March 31st, this would be an update for the 2020 compliance period. So this is an update to the forecast. At that point, emissions and production should be well understood, and part of the certainty that we're trying to get there is the degree to which sites will be choosing fund payment versus credit retirement for compliance purposes. I've got a couple of short slides here about the cost containment program. So again, the cost containment program was an element of the CCIR regulation, and it has transitioned to the tier program. In terms of eligibility, we're talking about large final emitters or opted-in facilities where the annual tier compliance costs are greater than 3% of annual facility sales or 10% of facility profits. There's a couple of mechanisms to support facilities that are enabled under the cost containment program. So one of those is the removal of the compliance credit limit. So this allows for the usage of emissions performance credits or offset credits to cover 100% of compliance obligation. There is also allowance for additional emissions benchmark allocations to bring the annual costs down to those 3 or 10% eligibility levels. So the deadline to apply for the 2020 compliance year is March 31st, 2021. And those applications can cover the 2020 and future years up to 5 consecutive years. So if people are forecasting that need for 2020 as well as into the future, that application can cover that period. The application requirements include third-party audited financial statements as well as third-party validated emissions reductions plan. So the application needs to show the pathway that the facility is looking to take to reduce their obligations under the tier program. And if this program you think is applicable to your facility, there's additional information on the website as well as an application form. We won't go into more depth on this program this morning, but if you do have questions about it, you can of course send the department an email. Okay, I'll say a couple things briefly about the specified gas reporting program. So again, the specified gas reporting program has been in place for a number of years in Alberta. It's a mandatory greenhouse gas reporting program for facilities that emit over 10,000 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. This threshold is aligned with Environment and Climate Change Canada's greenhouse gas reporting program, or GHGRP. The specified gas reporting program builds on voluntary reporting by Alberta emitters that began in the 1990s. This particular regulation was passed in 2003. The department will continue to work with Environment Climate Change Canada to use the one window reporting system, which is also normally called SWIM. So in this way, folks are able to do a single data reporting to satisfy the requirements of the federal greenhouse gas reporting program, as well as the specified gas reporting regulation. So we're trying to make that process easy, and we'll continue to work with Environment Climate Change Canada to look for improvements there. The emissions that are reported are used to help with the policy development and analysis, and also support the national inventory reporting that Canada does internationally. The standard for the SGR will be updated, and we'll talk a little bit more about this on the next slide. There also continues to be a requirement to supply boundary files or geospatial files under the GHGRP. And so if you've submitted that file previously and your boundary is unchanged, please feel free to submit the same file that you had last year. So for the 2020 year, facilities that are regulated under tier are expected to use the Alberta greenhouse gas quantification methodologies that have been published on our website. Facilities that don't report under tier, so facilities that are not under the tier program, may use either the Alberta greenhouse gas quantification methodologies or the quantification methodologies for the carbon competitiveness incentive regulation and the specified gas reporting regulation. So that would allow those folks that aren't covered under tier to carry forward with the same methods that they used last year. So again, any tier within the methodology can be used as tier 1 methods are aligned, or sorry, level 1 methods, I should say, are aligned with the minimum requirements for the greenhouse gas reporting program. There is still a requirement that equation numbers must be reported in the SWIM system. So the equation numbering is mostly the same as what's laid out in the AQM and the quantification methodology for the CCIR and SGRR, but there are a few differences, and the department will be supplying a lookup table that will help people in terms of choosing the right drop downs depending which quantification methodology they're using as part of their SGRR reporting. So look forward to some additional information to come out on the SGRR that will help guide folks through that selection of the methodology numbers in the SWIM portal. And I guess finally, just a note that the production reporting requirements were eliminated for products that compete with products in tier. So a reduced requirement now to report production under the SGRR. Okay, I'm going to go through a few slides looking at prior period results and learnings that we've had from prior iterations of industrial greenhouse gas programs that we've had in the province. This slide provides a little bit of a summary of prior period offset use, EPC use, fund credit payment, as well as total compliance submission under the various years of the program. So we can see there has been under CCIR, as was I guess expected, an increase in the total compliance obligation. And also there has been an increase in the fund payment generally, as we've transitioned from $15 per ton program through to 2020, which is the last year of a $30 program. I'll maybe ask if Jason is available, and he can walk through the next 2 or 3 slides related to the offset program.
Yeah, thanks, John. This, I think, will be pretty quick. I think some folks are also just saying the quality's gone down a bit again. But I think I can still speak to this anyways. So just wanted to show some of our results from the offset system in last year's compliance. So this is just a figure showing the types and volumes of offsets that were submitted last year for compliance. So the majority came from just a couple of protocols, as you, I guess, as maybe you can see in the top, from wind, CCS, conservation cropping, NERP, and then the remaining some constituted 26%. Also just wanted to point out that last year no offsets were retired in the federal equivalent of tier, but they were eligible and they will continue to be. So I think we're gonna try to post the slides later too. So if folks want to take a look at the text in more detail, it'll be available afterwards. So can we go to the next slide, please, John? So also just wanted to show some results of the types of offsets that were serialized last year, and also indicate that as of, well, the dates on here is actually wrong, but as of yesterday, I think there were 13.3 megatons of offsets that were available to be used in the, for compliance, I guess, this year and into the future. Last year, there were 21 new projects added as well. And wanted to point out for everyone that the types of protocols that are generating lots of offsets in our system have started to change a bit. So you can see CCS has started to take a larger role. The third one there is greenhouse gas emission reductions from pneumatic sites. So that's from a lot of methane reduction, basically. So, next slide, please, John. And just wanted to quickly clarify that if a facility is opted into tier, they're not eligible for offset generation anymore, because the activity becomes basically double counted, or it's already priced by tier. Some aggregates may still be able to participate depending on what they're doing. And just wanted to give a little overview of developments in the protocol space. So we just published a new protocol that updated and merged 2 previous ones related to turning agricultural or organic wastes into biogas. We have 2 protocols under revision. One of them is closer to being published. That's the solution gas reduction one, and it'll probably be renamed the vent gas reduction protocol, I believe. And then lastly, we're still working with the proponents for biocover for landfill and improved forest management on private land protocol. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Jason. Okay, so the next few slides, we're going to go through a few kind of high-level learnings that we've had from, I guess, implementation of SGR and CCIR. So maybe the first thing we'll highlight a little bit is usage of credits. So there is a maximum amount that credits can be used to cover your compliance obligation. So that's 60% under tier, and then 40% of that may be pre-2017 vintage credits. So we also have the expiry of credits that was introduced under CCIR and continued under tier. So just a little update on that. So the 2014 and older credits expire after this 2020 compliance period. So that looks like it's in good shape. There's not really a significant volume of those credits remaining, about 68,000 tons of offsets and about 194,000 tons of EPCs. And just also a reminder that 2015 and 2016 credits will expire 2022. And there we have 3.3 megatons of offsets and 2.2 megatons of EPCs. So far, we look to be in terms of good shape of not stranding any credits through expiry. A few things to improve in terms of credit usage. So credits need to be held by the person responsible when you're using them for compliance purposes. In addition, when you're using EPCs, credits should be in the account of the facility which is using them. And also credits need to be in the pending retired status when you submit your compliance report. So you may need to on the registry transfer credits and put them into the pending retired status to use them. We'll go into a little bit more detail on that later. Also a reminder that there's separate tabs in the compliance report for offsets and EPCs. So make sure you're putting offsets in the offsets tab and emissions performance credits in the EPC tab. And also make sure that serial ranges are correct and match the reported totals. So we do have a lot of follow-up that we end up having to do in terms of serial range reporting. Some learnings that we've had in terms of the quantification methodology documents that people submit along with their compliance reports. So again, the facility is responsible for preparing a quantification methodology document. So the purpose of that is to outline the methods that have been used to develop the emissions and production reported for the facility. We have seen, and this is somewhat understandable, we have seen QMDs that haven't been updated or partially updated. So certainly we understand there was a significant timing challenges and changes with 2018 in terms of the introduction of new quantifications. So that was part of a driver for the 2018 year. We don't want the quantification methodology document to have annual values. So the expectation is that you're not having to update this QMD every year. But only when your methods change or when you're adopting an update to our methodological requirements. And we have supplied a example of what the QMD should include and how it should be laid out in the compliance standard. So again, this document is an important reference for verification and also for our internal reviews of compliance reporting. And again, the quantification methodology document should reflect the quantification levels that are required under the program in terms of mandatory quantifications, except where a deviation has been granted. A few learnings in terms of emissions completeness. So again, as mentioned, direct emissions mean all specified gases released from sources located at the facility not including biomass CO2 emissions or fuels where the federal fuel charge was paid at a time when an exemption certificate was in place. So direct emissions is quite comprehensive in terms of what should be covered there. So again, all emissions originating within the facility boundary. And so the facilities have supplied, and we've, I guess, shared back in most cases the boundary files that we have in place for the facilities. And again, things like drilling, service rigs, contractors, or etc. are in scope in terms of what's within the boundary. A number of contractor emissions are intended to be dealt with in terms of fuels where the federal fuel charge was paid at a time when the exemption certificate was in place. So, for example, if you have contractors working on site and they're bringing onto site their own fuel where they've paid the federal fuel charge, those emissions are excluded, assuming you have an exemption certificate. Estimates can be used where the source meets our criteria for a negligible emission source. So, that would be, I guess, the other exception to the use of the mandatory quantification requirements is the category of negligible emissions. So very small sources of emissions, as defined within our standards, can be estimated. A few learnings about verifications, some areas maybe for improvement. So review of production quantities is sometimes less complete than the review of emissions under verifications that are developed for the department. So this is maybe especially true with some of our more complicated production metrics, such as the Alberta Gas Processing Index or the Alberta Complexity Weighted Barrel metrics. So there's a lot of moving parts in some of those production metrics, and so it's important that those get covered in the verification. We've also seen to confirm and to work with the QMD document provided by the facility to confirm that that's a reasonable reflection of the methodologies that were actually used. One thing that's also been a little bit lacking, I guess, is confirmation back to the physical meter readings. So the expectation is the verifier is kind of working backwards through the process to prove out the chain of calculation back to the physical meter readings, and sometimes that's not followed all the way back. And also confirmation of the correct application of benchmarks. So again, the verifier should be making sure that in the compliance reporting, folks are using the benchmarks that have been assigned to them. A few maybe reminders around deviation requests. So again, we've set out the quantification methodologies. Where you're not able to fully follow the quantification methodologies, you are, I guess, allowed to request a deviation. So deviation is not intended for cases where you could follow the prescription, but it's not your preferred approach. So where there is a prescribed quantification that hasn't been followed and no deviation is in place, there should be a verification finding related to that. And again, deviations are time limited. They can last, we only issue them for 1 year. And the intent is that part of the request should outline how the prescription can be met in future periods. And we're certainly able to work with sites where the resolution of the problem isn't possible within a 1 year period. So the deviations are also a very useful feedback tool for us to understand where I guess some of the rub points maybe are for individual facilities around the prescribed quantification. And in many cases, it's I guess led us to again improve, extend, or change the quantification requirements. few reminders around confidentiality. So if you're requesting confidentiality in the form, the expectation is that you're supplying a letter to justify how the data meets the requirements for confidential or prescribed data in the regulation. And again, the department will review those and accept or reject. So please do review our decision letters in case there may have been elements that were rejected in your request. Overall, over the past couple of years under CCIR, we've seen that reporting of indirect quantities has gone fairly well. So this was a new requirement under CCIR. So reporting of imported hydrogen, heat, and electricity. So one of the things that we do is that we kind of group facilities together in terms of heat balances. So we expect kind of the heat export to be in reasonable agreement with imported heat across industrial facilities. And we've seen that that's been working out pretty well, and we'll be checking that again for 2020. Our first little bit, I'll maybe pause for questions at this point. I see we've got a few in the Q&A, so we can maybe work through some of those, and please do ask questions if you have them. So I'll step through some of these. Can you please explain how the benchmark is set for new facilities? Earlier slides from AEP stated benchmarks are set at 95% historic emissions intensity. Benchmarks are decreased by 5% per year to reach the full reduction target. So that's correct. So for new facilities other than I guess electricity facilities under the regulation, and for electricity facilities, there's a transition provision there. But basically new large emitter or opt-in facilities will start setting their benchmark using their second year of commercial operation, and their first compliance reporting will be on their third year of commercial operation. And for that third year of commercial operation, the reduction target will be 5%. For the fourth year, it will be 10%. And for the fifth year, it will again drop either by 5% or to align with the prevailing reduction target under tier, depending on the timeline. Okay, the next question here. If we have acid gas injection in our aggregate pool facilities, will we be able to generate offsets? If yes, what does the process look like? So we're going to have an offset, or sorry, not an offset, a aggregate session this afternoon. So maybe I would encourage folks to hold any aggregate questions that they've got till this afternoon, and we can treat them there. Jason, if you have any thoughts on that, you can add them. My understanding is that the acid gas injection protocol was withdrawn a number of years ago, and it's typically the case that we don't consider acid gas disposal as an emission, so that I think we've already kind of built that into the accounting. But please feel free to ask that again this afternoon. Please confirm treatment of formation CO2 for tier reporting, in particular for CO2 entrained in feed and are included in IP CO2. So again, I guess a couple elements to this question, and we'll cover this a little bit later on this morning. But we have phased out formation CO2 as a distinct category under tier. With the intention that the emissions that you would have reported under formation CO2 get reported, I guess, under a category that's more to do with how they're released. So typically, that would most likely be venting. We do also define industrial process emissions in the regulation. So we have, or not in the regulation, I guess, but in the quantification standard. So again, I would say refer to the definition of industrial process emissions in terms of what can be covered in that category. Okay, will you have a lookup table for equation numbers in CCIR and tier that are the same, but the equation number has changed? And so we are looking to create a mapping that will help people do their reporting into the SWIM system, where the SWIM system has a, I believe, a drop down for the previous CCIR methodology. So we will create a mapping that will help people, I guess, translate the methods that they're maybe applying under the tier quantification methodology back to what's going to be in the interface for the SWIM system for SGRR. Okay, it was mentioned that the QMD should not contain annual value, but the QMD requirement includes Section 8, sample calculation. Does that mean a facility do not need to update the latest compliance year data, example 2020, if there's not a change to the calculation? So yeah, that's the intention. Like we still do want to see the sample calculation, but it doesn't need to be using current year's data if the method is still the same. So really, we want the QMD to reflect the methodologies that were used, not necessarily have to do with current year data. So the trigger to update the QMD should really be a change in the quantification methodology for the facility. And that certainly could be a change in order to adapt to an update that we've made to our quantification methodology requirements. Okay, please clarify if a facility is an opt-in facility, you will not be eligible to apply for offset credits. So that is generally the case. And the reason for that is that the emissions coverage for opt-in facilities is fairly complete. So there's not, there aren't really reduction opportunities that aren't then priced through the tier facility calculation. So there is a sense in which, like, if you're an opted-in facility and you capture CO2 and send it to a CCS or EOR project, you're in a sense, I guess, a participant in an offset process, but it's really not. There aren't really offset opportunities that are available on site for the facility because the pricing that we have as an opted-in facility is quite complete. Jason, feel free to add to that answer if you want.
I think that covered it.
Okay, okay, good question here. This is a good question. The benchmark issued are valid for 1 year based on a letter from AEP. Is it fair to assume that the benchmark will be valid for 5 years if the facility operation remains the same? So we've so far we've issued benchmarks only for the 2020 year, and that's to get everyone's benchmark established. Once we've gotten everybody's benchmark established, our intention is to issue benchmarks for 2021 and possibly a couple years beyond that that build in the 1% tightening. So the benchmark that you have for 2020 will change for 2021 to reflect the 1% tightening rate, and we will be issuing those hopefully in the not too distant future. Okay, another question. Would a tier LFE opt-in or aggregate facility be able to generate offsets under CO2 capture and permanent storage in deep sea line aquifer protocol? So again, I think I answered this question. So you could certainly be a participant in a carbon capture and storage project. If you're sequestering on site, like right at your facility, it's likely that will be treated with a EPC calculation rather than through the offset program. Okay, will there be an updated ABCWB calculation spreadsheet provided for refineries and upgraders? These were great under the CCIR. We are working up one, I guess, as we speak for refiners, so we hope to kind of run past folks. And then if that, I guess if that's a useful tool, we can certainly look to extend that to upgraders. Are gasification methods with wood or agricultural waste considered a biomass emission and therefore not a direct emission? So I believe that would be the case. I'm trying to think. So certainly the CO2 from the biomass in those situations would be true. I guess if you're doing I guess some kind of gas shift reaction as part of that, I don't think that's going to introduce any CO2 that's not biomass CO2. So I believe the answer is yes, but if you need follow-up, maybe email us on that one. Yeah, okay. So we've got a question here. Entering imported electricity into the compliance sheet before automatically adjusts the allowable emissions in section E. Is this calculation methodology outlined anywhere in the guidance documents? Can you please provide a reference? So this, I guess this is actually outlined in the regulation itself also, and we'll go through some examples how that looks actually later this morning. Okay. Just looking at the clock and what we've got here, a few of these we'll kind of cover in a little bit more detail as we go through the morning. Anyway, but how cogens are treated under tier, and is there any guidance? So there's two elements to, I guess, cogen treatment under tier. The treatment under tier is really, I'm going to call it a self-generation approach, not really limited to cogen. So the guidance there to look at first off would be in the benchmark, a standard for developing benchmarks, because there are adjustments for self-generation that are done during the benchmarking process. So that's probably the most important place to look. The other element is the accounting for electricity that's brought on site. So if your cogen results in a reduced electricity brought on site, that gets reflected in the compliance calculations. And also if your cogen results in export electricity, there is allocation for that also. If we are missing data for a piece of equipment, can we use the manufacturer's specs to calculate emissions, or should we request a deviation? So I guess I would maybe suggest if you can email in the specifics there. We do have in our quantification methodologies, we do have methods to allocate fuels to prorate, I guess, fuel use to different kinds of equipment on site. So that might be an option for you, depending what kind of data it is that you're missing. But I guess if that doesn't help, I suggest to maybe send an email to our email address with a little bit more specifics there. You just mentioned that everyone should have 2020 benchmarks. Does this include refineries or upgraders? So I guess I was meaning everyone. I should have said will have 2020 benchmarks. I know that we're still working with a number of facilities, both opted-in facilities as well as some of the refiners, in terms of setting facility-specific benchmarks for 2020. So I guess what I would say is if you don't have a facility-specific benchmark for 2020 and your product doesn't have a high-performance benchmark, and you're not in the process of submitting a facility-specific benchmark application, to get in touch with the department. Two questions. Please confirm that all large emitters subject to tier must make the reduction in allowable emissions for imports of hydrogen regardless of use, including as a fuel for power generation. So that answer to the first question is true. with the exception for, I guess, refiners or upgraders, where we've kind of, we have a distinct treatment there where we're providing an allocation for the generation of hydrogen rather than accounting for imports. And then two, what is the status of the EOR emissions offset quantification protocol? So I guess very briefly, I would say the EOR protocol has been published in draft, and we're still working with stakeholders to finalize that. I don't know, Jason, if you want to add anything on the EOR protocol.
Sorry, I had to step away for a second. So I can answer that question in the chat.
Okay. So I'll maybe take just two more questions and we'll move back to our agenda, and then these questions will remain in the queue and we can pick them up as we have question periods later. So does an opt-in facility require verification for its compliance reports, or is it exempt from this requirement? So anybody who's submitting a compliance report needs to have it verified. Again, we mentioned there is a grace period for having to submit a compliance report if you're a very newly operating facility. Okay. You mentioned that forecast report is required for facilities that emit over 1 megaton. I would like to know if the report is required for facilities that generate less than 1 megaton. So no, so forecasting reports are only required for facilities that meet the definition of a forecasting facility, and so those are those that have emitted over 1 megaton in a year since 2016. Okay. Maybe I'll put the questions on pause and we can move into our next section of the presentation for this morning. So this next section is on obtaining verification. So this gives a bit of an overview of verification requirements and working with your verifier. So again, maybe just tying back to the last question, all facilities included opted-in facilities regulated under tier must hire a third-party assurance provider to verify their compliance report. Again, the purpose of the verification is to provide assurance to the department that there are no material errors in the facility's compliance report. And so I guess, as we said before, if there are material errors, those need to get addressed before the compliance report is submitted. For the compliance submission on June 30th this year, the facility is required to submit verification report that includes a statement of verification, a statement of qualifications, as well as a conflict of interest form. So those three elements are need to be signed by the lead verifier and or designated signing authority. So maybe just to highlight, this year we've got approximately 460 facilities that are going to require verifications for 2020. So that's, I guess, more than doubled from 2019. So I guess just be aware of that, and also that it can take 6 to 8 weeks or more, depending on the complexity of the facility and the issues involved to complete verification. So we would encourage people to start on that process early. And again, I would highlight if facilities are having challenges finding a verifier that can complete the verification for 2020 to get in touch with the department, because we'd like to, I guess, understand how things are going in that regard. So again, we do have a standard that sets out the requirements for the verifier in completing their work. A little bit of a highlight of some of the process that the verifier will go through, and this is kind of very, very high level, but maybe useful for facilities to understand. So the first step really is for the verification or the assurance provider to establish that there's not a conflict of interest in taking on the work, and so they'll do that assessment, including completing our conflict of interest form, but they also may have their own internal processes in addition to that. There'll be a contracting phase. And so, I mean, you'll be contracting for the work. And I guess one of the important things that we would suggest that facilities should ensure is that the verifier, I guess, is qualified to do the work under the regulation. So good to establish that, I guess, as part of the contracting phase. There's the provision of the materials required for the verification process to the verifier by the facility. So again, the verifier, just to be absolutely clear, is not preparing materials for the compliance reporting, but they're reviewing and confirming the suitability of those materials against the program criteria. So the verifier will look for those materials and construct a verification plan, which in constructing the verification plan, part of their work is to conduct a risk assessment of, what areas have potential to create material misstatements in the compliance reporting, as well as a sampling plan in order to lay out the evidence that they're going to gather and assess in coming to their verification conclusion. Most often, the verifier will have data and information requests of the facility. So based on the materials that they have initially, they'll most likely ask for additional materials or further evidence. A site visit is typically required. I'll speak a little bit to, I guess, a special circumstance for the 2020 compliance period and some of the allowance we've made for virtual site visits. The verifier will also review and analyze the data and the information and the evidence that they've collected. They'll develop and communicate the findings and issues to the facility, some of those which may need to get addressed before the compliance report can be submitted. And then again, the verifier will report on any remaining issues as part of their verification report, and they'll do that in the report template that we've provided, and then they'll sign off the documents, and those will be available for submission. So on the site visit, verifiers are required to conduct the site visit unless authorized by a director under the Act. So again, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we've granted authorizations to verifiers to conduct virtual site visits up to September 1st, 2021. So this should cover the 2020 compliance reports that are submitted. It should also cover benchmark applications, which might currently be under development, as well as emissions offset project reports that are completed ahead of that September 1st deadline. And again, requirements or what you should consider in requirements in conducting virtual site visits are outlined in our verification standard. So the requirements that the verifier is working under, again, are set out in our standard, and part 1 of that standard is binding on the third-party assurance provider. So the part 1 of that verification standard kind of does have the power of law under the regulation and put some obligations on the verifier. Facilities, though, are responsible to ensure that the selected verifier does meet the regulatory requirements, because that's the obligation, essentially, or the expectation that should be part of your contracting process there. And I guess in addition, for the 2020 year, verifiers are required to complete a verification training. We have had a large number of verifiers complete that training, and we have a pathway for folks that weren't able to attend the training to go through the materials and to submit a quiz to us. So that's there for your awareness. And just for facilities awareness too, there are offenses under the regulation in terms of folks that conduct verifications when they're not qualified, and also it's an obligation on the facility to make sure that the verifier meets the requirements under the program. We also put some time limits on consecutive verifications to try to limit the potential for familiarity risk with the verifiers. And so for regulated facilities, verifiers may do 5 consecutive years of verification, which would need to be followed by a 2-year break before they can resume work with that facility. And then for emissions offset projects, we have a limit of 5 consecutive reports for offsets with a 2 reporting period break. So again, the verification or the regulation does require a positive opinion on the statement of verification. So that's what's in the regulation. We can work often with qualified opinions, but we'll kind of look at those on a case-by-case basis in terms of what the nature of the qualification is and the scope of what it covers. And we do have the verification report templates available for interest if facilities or offset projects want to look at the kinds of things that go into the verification report. A few risk areas in terms of what we've seen for verification results in the past. So these include production, I think as we mentioned before, as well as looking at the imports of heat, hydrogen, electricity. Again, the need to dive down into some of the source data, the alignment with quantification methodologies, also important. And then the verifier needs to be calculating, like as they have findings that come through the verification, they need to be calculating the total error that results from those findings to make sure that those issues don't trigger our materiality thresholds. And verifiers also need to retain their working papers and documents, and we may, under some circumstances, request those materials. The government itself does contract assurance providers to re-verify some some portion of submissions. So that could be compliance reports, emission offset project reports, or benchmark applications. We select those on a risk-based approach, as well as a few random selections in the year. And we conduct that work. We have pre-qualified vendors in the assurance space, and we issue statements of work to them to cover those annual pieces. So generally, those re-verifications do also follow our verification standard. For 2019, we ended up not yet kicking off the re-verifications for 2019. So we are looking at the potential of combining the 2019 and 2020 work for re-verifying compliance reports. I'll pause again there, maybe for a few more questions to see if there's anything on that verification section or something we didn't cover before. So a question here, does the 5-year verification term apply to the individual lead or peer verifier or the company conducting the verification? I believe the way that we've laid that out, it would be any of those 3. Maybe Maggie can correct me if I'm wrong there.
Yep, that's correct. It would apply to those individuals in the team.
Okay, great. Does AEP expect verifiers to look into the veracity of the data going into Petronex? Verification standard does not states not required, but verifiers like to go there. Where does AEP stand on this? This is probably more so a question for this afternoon in terms of aggregates. So where our quantification methodology has set out the use, like I guess the direct use of Petronex data, I don't think that the verifier needs to look into the basis of where the Petronex data was originating. Where the Petronex data, I guess, is not spoken to in our quantification methodologies, but it's being used for compliance purposes, then I think it does make sense for the verifier to go a little further in that case. Can you confirm that if the third party has not done verification for 5 years consecutively, they continue to provide verification. For example, 4 years of verification followed by a year break, then the third party is able to conduct verification for another 5 years. So the short answer is no. So if you did 4 verifications and a year break, you could do 1 more verification, and then you would need a 2-year break. So that's the way we've kind of laid that out. How were the results from re-verifications different from the original verifications? So this is a good question. I mean, we have found that we have, through the course of re-verifications, found both, I guess, immaterial and material issues which weren't identified in the original verification. So that's, I mean, that's part of the value that we see, I guess, in that process. Is that it also gives us a little bit of a gauge in terms of the consistency of the verification across different entities. Sorry. Question, where can we get verification training? So just to maybe doubly clarify, the requirement to have training is one of the requirements to be qualified as a verifier, but certainly not the only requirement. The training that we have provided is available on our website, and so people can view the training session and take the quiz that's posted on our website. But just to be fully clear, taking that training that's on our website is not the only requirement to be qualified as a verifier. Okay, the next question I think is the same. Would AEP be able to share the sectors that are expected to have HPBs published shortly? I don't have those off the top of my head. I think we're kind of in progress, and for the most part, our policy team has been working with those sectors that they're developing HPBs for. But I think we're hoping to have those HPBs published, and people will be notified at that time. If you need them sooner than that, or if you're interested to know that sooner than that, maybe send us an email and we can get back to you. So here's a question: Do the verifiers have a certificate to show that they have completed the verification training? I guess we're just in process actually of working up and sending out confirmations for the folks that have attended and completed the training. So they'll have an email record of that. I don't know, Maggie, do you want to talk anything or add any points to
that? Working on that. Folks. Training session, a confirmation.
Okay, great. So if that answer broke up a little bit, the summary is that we're working on sending out those confirmations, and they should be available probably over the course of the next week or two. Okay. Does the AEP have a list of third-party verifiers that it recommends for verification, or is it up to the facilities to search and find the verifiers? So we don't have at this point a published list. So it's up to the facilities to do a bit of scouting there. I think I would encourage, if facilities are having a real challenge to find a verifier, to please get in touch with the department, and we'll see how we can possibly assist there. Okay, I think we've answered this question, but maybe it got in the queue again. Do all opted-in facilities require annual verification, or just over a certain threshold? So all facilities that are submitting a compliance report need that compliance report to be verified. Okay, maybe we can move on here. Let's see what we have next. Okay, I just have to queue up something. Give me a second. Okay, give me 1 minute. Sorry, just give me 1 second while I queue up the next piece of materials here.
The objectives of the AQM are to provide a consistent and standardized approach to quantify emissions, production, and other reported parameters, provide level playing field for facilities within the same sector and across all sectors, standardize benchmarking approaches for regulated facilities, and align with federal greenhouse gas reporting programs where it is appropriate. The mandatory quantification methodologies for the 2020 reporting period includes Chapter 1, Stationary Fuel Combustion, Chapter 4, Venting, Chapter 5, On-Site Transportation, Chapter 8, Industrial Processes, Chapter 12, Imports, Chapter 13, Production, Chapter 14, Carbon dioxide emissions from combustion of biomass, Chapter 15, Aggregate Facilities, Chapter 16, Cogeneration Benchmark Calculation, and Chapter 17, Measurements, Sampling, Analysis, and Data Management. The following appendices provide additional information and mandatory requirements that are referenced by the chapters noted in the previous slide. This includes Appendix A, References, Appendix B, Fuel Properties, Appendix C, General Calculation Instructions, Appendix D, Conversion Factors, and Appendix E, additional information for the Alberta Gas Processing Index. Facilities may submit deviation requests to the department for mandatory requirements that the facility is unable to meet. The facility may propose an alternative and conservative method in place of the mandatory requirement. The department will then review and provide a time-limited approval to the facility if the deviation request is accepted. Please note that deviations are approved for a period of up to 1 year and are not intended to be permanent approvals for deviations. The expectation is that the facility will eventually meet the mandatory requirement. We want to provide an update on the status of upcoming chapters that are anticipated to be posted in 2021. A draft of Chapter 2 flaring is anticipated to be posted soon, but the methodologies will not be mandatory for the 2020 reporting period. There will be opportunities for stakeholders to provide comments on the chapter before it is finalized. A draft of Chapter 3 fugitives is also anticipated to be posted later in 2021. Finally, we have made the decision to remove formation CO2 as a separate source category for reporting. Therefore, Chapter 10, Formation CO2, will be removed from the AQM. This does not mean that CO2 entrained in fuels and feeds are excluded from reporting or in the direct emissions. Instead, these emissions will be reported as an emission under different source categories. For example, CO2 that is emitted by venting would be reported under the venting category. Now we want to provide an overview of mandatory quantification methodologies that are covered in various chapters, starting with stationary fuel combustion emissions, which are presented in Chapter 1. In this slide, we want to show a distribution of emissions by source category and emissions type. Not surprisingly, the majority of emissions, approximately 87% of emissions from regulated facilities, are from stationary fuel combustion emissions. This is the main reason why we place a lot of emphasis on the accuracy of emissions from stationary fuel combustion. As you can see in the smaller graph, the CO2 emissions are the predominant greenhouse gas that is emitted from stationary fuel combustion. Here's another figure that shows the distribution of emissions by sector and source category. With the exception of a few sectors, stationary fuel combustion emissions represent the majority of emissions from facilities in most sectors. In this slide, this is another illustration showing that the predominant greenhouse gas that is emitted is CO2 in most sectors from stationary fuel combustion. Levels for tier regulated facilities are provided in the standard for completing greenhouse gas compliance and forecasting reports. As mentioned earlier, we have changed the terminology from tier classification under CCIR to level classification under tier. Functionally, these are the same, but we didn't want any confusion in terminology as our regulation is also called tier. Typically in the AQM, methodologies that are classified as level 3 may be used for CO2 emissions quantification, while methodologies that are classified as level 2 may be used for methane and nitrous oxide emissions quantification. Facilities are allowed to use a method that is higher than the minimum level classification that is prescribed for the particular greenhouse gas. The AQM also provides methodologies for facilities that are regulated under the specified gas reporting regulation. The levels for these regulated facilities are provided in the specified gas reporting standard. There has been some changes in the level classifications between methodologies prescribed under CCIR for the 2018 and 2019 reporting years versus tier, which is for 2020 and beyond. The main difference is the change in level classification for the SEMS method, which is method 1-5 in the AQM. Previously, this was a method that was identified as level 4 under CCIR, but we have changed it to level 3A, meaning that it is a method that is only available when a facility is unable to apply a level 3 method. The reason for this change is because of the limitations in the accuracy of emissions quantification using SEMS. In the next few slides, we will provide a quick overview of the methods in this chapter. We'll present in these slides what the methods are applicable for, the equations, and requirements for the method. Please do take the time to review these methods in the AQM in detail before initiating any verifications. Method 1-1 is a method for the quantification of CO2 from the combustion of non-variable fuels, which includes fuels like diesel, gasoline, and propane. This method allows for the application of default emission factors because the expectation is that the carbon content is relatively stable for these types of fuels. Therefore, this method can be used under any level classification. In the following slides, we've also included some highlighted sections to indicate areas where we have identified deficiencies in the verification process. The red highlighted items indicate areas where we have found a high level of deficiencies, whereas the orange highlighted items indicate a medium level of deficiencies identified. Method 1-2 is the high heating value correlation method that was adapted from the Federal Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. This is a method that is exclusively used by SGRR reporters or reporters for the GHGRP, and not for regulated facilities under tier. It is a correlation method that is based on the high heating value of the natural gas or fuel that is being consumed by the facility. Method 1-3 is a level 3 method that is used by regulated facilities under tier. This is a method for the combustion of variable fuels, meaning that the carbon content is variable and requires actual measurements. Typically, these carbon content or gas composition analysis are supplied by a third party or measured by the facility. It is the responsibility of the verifier to review this documentation as part of the verification process. The measurement frequency is dependent on the type of fuel that is being consumed, and these are presented in Table 17-1. We want to emphasize again the importance of ensuring the accuracy of the data that is being collected and used for this methodology, as again, stationary fuel combustion emissions represent a significant portion of emissions from regulated facilities. Method 1-4 is a new method that is introduced that allows a facility to use a mass balance approach to calculate the amount of carbon in the fuel that is combusted. In order to use this method, the facility must know the total carbon that is being supplied to the facility based on custody transfer or third-party documentation. As well, there can only be one unknown variable in the mass balance. For example, if a supply of natural gas to the facility is either being used as a feed for an industrial process and fuel for combustion, if the facility has an accurate measurement of the feed for the industrial process and carbon content measurement, the facility can use this mass balance approach to then calculate the carbon that remains that would be combusted. Currently, this method does not allow carbon in vented emissions or fugitive emissions to be included in the mass balance. Method 1-5 is the Continuous Emissions Monitoring Systems, or CEMS method. Again, this is a method that is classified as level 3A. This is a method that is used based on the measurements of CO2 or measurements of O2 to quantify CO2 emissions. As discussed previously, based on further review by the department, the level classification was adjusted from level 4 to level 3A. This means that this method can only be used if a regulated facility is unable to apply a level 3 method. The decision was made because it is believed that there are limitations in the accuracy of applying CEMS to quantify CO2 emissions. Now we are going to review the level classification and methods used for methane and nitrous oxide from stationary fuel combustion. There has been a change in level classification of methodologies from CCIR to tier. Under tier, emission factors, whether sector-based or technology-based, may be used for any level classification. The quantification of methane and nitrous oxide from stationary fuel combustion relies on the use of emission factors that are available for different types of fuels that are combusted and technologies that are used. These emission factors are provided in tables 1-2 to 1-7. A summary of these tables are provided in this slide. The facility must select the appropriate emission factors for the fuel that's being consumed and the technologies that are being used at the facility. The verifier is required to assess whether the emission factors applied are appropriate. The CEMS method, which is identified as method 1-7, may be used for methane or nitrous oxide quantification instead of using a method based on the default emission factors. Unlike stationary fuel combustion emissions, venting emissions represent a much smaller percent of regulated emissions. These emissions are predominantly from the upstream oil and gas sector and the pipeline transmission sector. Venting emissions consist mainly of methane and CO2 emissions. It is noted again that the minimum level classification for methane quantification is 2, while the level classification for CO2 is 3. Venting methodologies for methane and CO2 are typically the same, so the methodologies presented in this chapter are generally acceptable for the use under levels 2 and 3. Again, CO2 entrained in the fuel was previously classified as formation CO2. We have removed formation CO2 as an individual source category. However, these emissions would then have to be reported under the venting category if CO2 is being vented. Quantification methodologies for the following processes are prescribed in this chapter: produced gas and UOG facility methodologies, solid desiccant dehydrators, pigging and purges, atmospheric liquid storage tanks, pneumatic controls and pumps, compressor seals, glycol dehydrator, glycol refrigeration, acid gas removal and sulfur recovery units, hydrocarbon liquid unloading and loading, oil water separators, produced water venting, well test completion and workovers, process system blowdowns, gas well liquid unloading, and engine and turbine startups. Typical requirements for methodologies in this chapter includes measurements of gas compositions using methods that are prescribed by AER directives or analytical methods that are prescribed in Chapter 17. Quarterly sampling frequency is typically prescribed if it's not prescribed specifically for a particular method. Facilities may also use fuel gas composition if it is representative of the vented gas. Facilities should follow meter installation, calibrations, vent rate measurement, and vapor composition sampling frequencies that are prescribed by AER directives, and non-UOG facilities may follow industry best practices. And volume measurements must be adjusted to standard conditions as defined in Appendix C. Generally, the same methods and equations for the quantification of emissions from on-site transportation are the same as for stationary fuel combustion. Typically, CO2 emissions are based on gas compositions, or for non-variable fuels such as gasoline or diesel, default emission factors may be used. And methane and nitrous oxide emission factors are based on emission factors from the 2018 National Inventory Report. TIER does not intend to double price fuels. If fuels have already been subject to a levy, these emissions do not need to be reported or included in the total regulated emissions. For most facilities, transportation emissions are negligible. So a facility may apply an alternative and conservative methodology to estimate these emissions if they are deemed to be negligible. Earlier, we presented some figures that provide a distribution of emissions based on emission types and sectors that are regulated. Stationary fuel combustion emissions represent the largest portion of emissions. Second to stationary fuel combustion emissions are the industrial process emissions, which represents about 6% of emissions from regulated facilities. As you can see in this table, there are a few sectors that emit industrial process emissions, including chemicals, fertilizers, metals, minerals, and oil sands sectors. In the next few slides, we'll review briefly the different methods that are used to quantify industrial process emissions, which includes both carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide. Also, it should be noted that many of the methods prescribed in this chapter are not assigned a level classification. If there are no level classifications assigned to a method, the method can be applied for any level classification. Hydrogen production generates industrial process CO2 emissions from operations like steam methane reforming. Methods that are used to estimate these emissions include a direct feed oxidation method, CO2 mass balance by using the amount of raw unpurified hydrogen stream and the CO2 in the feed, hydrogen feed calculation method, and CO2 emissions from a mass balance approach that is based on the carbon content in the fuels and feeds that are used at the facility. CO2 that is consumed in urea production is a parameter that is included in the calculation of the total regulated emissions. The reason for the inclusion of this parameter in the TRE is the need to ensure consistency in the methodology used in benchmarking ammonia and other fertilizer products like urea. CO2 that is consumed in urea processes are typically from industrial process emissions, which is the reason why these methods have been included in this chapter. The method provided here is based on a stoichiometric ratio of CO2 generated to the urea that is produced. Industrial process CO2 emissions are also generated from the calcination of carbonates. Methods used to quantify these emissions include CO2 from calcinating calcium and magnesium carbonates, and CO2 from calcining carbonates in pulp mills. Similar to the methods presented in the previous slide, there are also methodologies for IPCO2 emissions generated from the use of carbonates. The carbonate consumption method is a level 1 method, which is the same as the method used for calcining carbonates in pulp mills. The level 3 method relies on a carbonate mass balance approach. And the level 4 method is based on a measured CO2 emission factor. Industrial process CO2 emissions are also generated from the production of ethylene oxide production. The methodology presented for this process is based on a mass balance approach that uses the quantity of ethylene in the feed, ethylene that is lost, and the quantity of ethylene oxide that is produced. And lastly, there are IPCO2 emissions that are generated from the use of carbon as a reductant. This method is based on the mass of carbon that is converted to CO2. Nitrous oxide emissions generated from nitric acid production are also considered to be industrial process emissions. In the AQM, there are 3 levels of methods that are used to quantify these emissions. Method 8-1 is a level 1 method that uses nitrous oxide emission factor for systems with abatement downtime. Method 8-2 is a level 2 method that is based on a nitrous oxide emission factor developed from measurements collected testing. And finally, SEMS is considered a level 3 method that may be used to quantify the nitrous oxide emissions directly.
Okay, I think at this point in our program, we'll probably take a 10-minute break, just recognizing the hour and that we've been at it fairly consistently here. So if we can return at, let's say, 5 to 11, and then we'll resume the session. Thanks so much. Okay, hopefully everyone had a chance to have a quick bio break and a little grab a cup of coffee or what have you. We'll resume now with a little bit of an overview of some of the quantification requirements for production under tier. The next section of this training will deal with production. Properly quantify as emissions in order to get the correct compliance outcomes. So products that are covered under tier will have a facility-specific benchmark and or a high-performance benchmark. Where there is a situation where both benchmarks exist, the larger or more generous of the two benchmarks will be applied for compliance purposes. The regulation itself sets out high-performance benchmarks for products in Schedule 2, and the quantification methodology document further describes the measuring and quantification of some of these products. Products that have only facility-specific benchmarks are not laid out in the regulation itself, nor are they covered in the quantification methodology. Information on the facility-specific benchmarks is supplied to the facility in a letter from the director. Not all facility-specific benchmarks are necessarily set on the product that is sold. It's a potential for there to be facility-specific benchmarks on intermediate products or potentially inputs to the facility. Some products covered by tier are also regulated or tracked by other organizations. For example, exported electricity is often metered and kept by the Alberta Electrical System Operator. Mine bitumen is covered by the Alberta Energy Regulator in the statistical series ST39. In situ bitumen, similarly covered in ST53. And then also the Alberta Gas Processing Index has a number of inputs that are covered by the AER and captured in Petronex. Following table lays out the facilities that have facility-specific benchmarks or high-performance benchmarks. So this list is dynamic, and we expect it will likely expand somewhat over time as new facilities opt in to the regulation. The sites on this, or the products on this list with the asterisks, denote those sites that have other external information which can be used to corroborate the production figures. Note that industrial heat is also marked in that way, and that's because typically industrial heat has both an exporting party and an importing party, and those two figures can be reconciled. So the regulation, as mentioned, sets out high-performance benchmarks. The following table lays out the high-performance benchmarks that are currently specified in the regulation. That list could be amended from time to time, and the regulation also sets out that high-performance benchmarks can be set by ministerial order by the minister at any point in time. So we have, I guess, both a general approach and specific approaches discussed in the quantification methodology. So unless otherwise specified, what we've indicated is that production data can be used. So that would be direct measurements and accounting or third-party sales records. So that excludes refining in situ oil sands and Alberta gas processing index, which we'll talk about a little bit more. And then also accounting or sales data with inventory adjustments can also be used for production purposes in the general approach. So when looking at production, it is important, as it is with emissions, to evaluate the evidence on which the production is based. So what is the source of that evidence or the documentation? Is the documentation based on the facility data management system? If it is based on the facility data management system, what is the underlying source of the data in terms of instrumentation or scales or measurement? So have the facility controls been adequately tested in regards to production? And then also, are there accounting records or third-party documentation to confirm quantities sold? So for example, in the case of electricity, there may be third-party records with the Alberta Electrical System Operator for the amount of electricity sent to the grid. So also be careful of black box production accounting. So ensure that there's some transparency or traceability to the production numbers that are presented. I'll talk a little bit about the production unit that's used for refining and upgrading under tier. So there are really three parts to this production unit, and this is the Alberta Complexity Weighted Barrel Unit. So one part is what we call the CWB production, and that basically is related to the throughput of specific refinery or upgrader units times an associated factor that scales the throughput for that type of unit. It also includes a CWB offsite. So this is related to the total input barrels. So this is calculated from the total input barrels, and those total input barrels are defined as all raw material inputs to the refinery, less transfers of raw materials from the refinery. So this is really intended to really kind of correct and normalize the correlation between the CWB metric and emissions at refiners and upgraders. The CWB non-crude really is a scaling of non-crude input barrels, including the total raw material processed by the refinery other than crude or other materials entering the atmospheric distillation unit. So that's the three factors that are combined through equation 1314-18 to calculate the Alberta Complexity Weighted Barrel for refiners or upgraders. So the each individual process unit may have a scaling factor that's used in the calculation of the production CWB, and those are laid out in a table based on the work by Solomon and Associates. So the table sets out the unit of measure. So that's typically barrels per standard day, and the capacity basis. So whether that's the output or the feed to the unit, or a particular product where multiple products are produced by the unit. So also to highlight that the FCCC unit, or the FCC unit, is the typically the largest contributor where that unit is present, and when working with that unit, the percent volume factor that is required is calculated under tier using the Grace-Davison method. So I'll talk a little bit about that factor. So that volume of coke on catalyst, the calculation has a number of steps. It's not difficult in terms of the math that's applied, but there's a large number of variables that go into the calculation of that percent volume coke on catalyst. The main principles are really related to the analysis, gas analysis from the flue gas from the process, as well as an understanding of the air feed into the process and the properties associated with that air feed. The flue gas flow is calculated, and then basically a mass balance is applied, which includes again those gas analysis components from the flue gas, as well as an understanding of the input gas feed, and then that's used to calculate that volume of coke. So coke is calculated, and then coke yield is also derived from this method. And you could apply this method also to calculate the CO2 emissions from the FCC unit. So a lot of variables, care should be taken in making sure that the inputs to this part of the equation are well supported and I guess well quantified. I'll talk a little bit too about the Alberta Gas Processing Index. So this is used at our large emitter or opted-in gas plants for the most part. So it's method 13.1 and 13.2 in the quantification methodology. 13.1 is based on a material balance for the gas plant instead of the direct measurement of specific flows, and that's to accommodate situations where some gas plants, older facilities, potentially don't have all of the required metering to make direct measurement, and so a method based on mass or material balances is supplied. Method 13-2 is intended for use where physical metering is required at the points that are needed in order to quantify the Alberta Gas Processing Index. So a little bit like the complexity weighted barrel, the gas processing index is essentially a throughput measure. So for different types of units, the throughput is multiplied by a scaling factor, and this is then added together in order to get an overall measure. So these scaling factors were, I guess, developed from sector data in terms of typical performance or emissions performance for those units. So the weighting factors are typically in tons CO2e per unit, per throughput unit. And so the resulting Alberta Gas Processing Index is basically a measure that's in tons CO2e related to kind of a standard gas processing facility. And again, the throughputs in many cases are tied to Petronex reporting for those facility types. So the Petronex data should be consulted, I guess, to confirm the correct calculation of the Alberta Gas Processing Index. So again, when looking at production, there's a number of areas that should be examined. We've created a list here where we've highlighted what we see as some of those requirements and the impact if some of those requirements are missed, where I guess the orange color has a medium impact, and the red color tends to have a higher impact in terms of accuracy of the resulting production information. So again, third-party data. So the referencing of third-party data where it's available to ensure that that there's a correlation or corroboration of the production evidence presented by the facility. Throughputs and product property calculations, so things related to moisture levels or additives or whatever. So in some cases there's corrections that may be required in order to get to a standardized moisture level. So assurance that those conversions have been done and done properly. Tracing down and looking at consistency of factors, parameters, and constants, and the support for those figures. The cross-referencing against invoices. The potential for, I guess, missing data procedures. The use of weighted averages where that's applied in order to come up with production figures. The consistency of the data that is used over the course of the calculation, and then reconciliations that may be required. So this might have to do with inventory adjustments or other kinds of reconciliations. And then also very important is where production is measured at volume, that the correct standard conditions have been applied in calculating production. Okay, we'll move on to the next section of the materials now. We do have a few questions in the queue. We could also take those at this time if there are some on the last section or previous. Okay, so here's a question. If there are updates which are not aligned with the information used for baseline, do we need to update or keep consistent with the baseline? So generally speaking, we are looking for consistency with the baseline. However, we'll be kind of taking that into account in terms of updates to the quantification methodology. So in general, we're looking for people to adopt the updates to the quantification methodology as we make them over time. So we are looking for consistency in the 2020 compliance reporting with the published AQM or I guess deviation requests where that's not possible. So question, what is AEP's recommended methodology for landfill emissions? So currently we don't have a prescribed methodology for landfill emissions. So we can work with facilities individually where they are looking to adopt a particular best practice method. Can Petronex data be used to calculate the production volumes for AG or the Alberta Gas Processing Index? So generally speaking, yeah, we're expecting Petronex values to be used where those are kind of laid out in the quantification methodology. Are byproducts of a facility also needed to be verified? If yes, is there a minimum production threshold under which they can be exempted? So again, really the verification that we're looking for relates to the compliance reporting. And so the products being reported for that purpose should be the products that have facility-specific benchmarks or high-performance benchmarks. And so if you have a product which doesn't have a benchmark, there's no need to report that, and hence there's no need to have that verified. Okay, so another question. Yeah, okay. So I guess this is just a confirmation of a comment from earlier. When does AAP expect to issue EPCs to facilities that generate EPCs in the 2020 compliance year? So in general, probably our goal under tier will be to issue EPCs where possible, kind of early in the subsequent year, so that they're available for compliance purposes. Most likely, we target sometime in January. So, for example, you submit your 2020 compliance report end of June. We'd aim to have EPCs available sometime in January of 2022 for potential use for the 2021 compliance year. Okay, so moving on, we'll get into the next section here where we talk about the methods of true up under tier, and a little bit of an overview of the regulatory scheme as it applies to the tons that are owed. So basically, under the tier program, imagining a couple of hypothetical emitters, emitter A, emitter B, they're each of them has a benchmark level. In this case, potentially they're each looking at a common benchmark, but these could be the facility-specific benchmarks. Emitter B is operating below or better than the benchmark level, and so has potential then to bank or to sell emissions performance credits because they're doing better than their benchmark level. Oops. We also have the ability of non-regulated and unpriced activities to participate through the emission offset market. So those activities that have a protocol that's approved within the Alberta system have potential to generate credits, which can also go into the carbon market. So those credits can be purchased and then used for compliance purposes against the amounts that are owed, and in addition, there can be payment into the fund. So I guess as currently structured, if there is an amount owed, there is a maximum that can be used, or that credit can be used to offset that amount that is owed. So again, the basis of the compliance calculation works from the tier total regulated emissions. And so for tier total regulated emissions, the emissions are defined within the reg as the direct emissions for the facility, less any imported CO2 from another regulated site, plus exported CO2. And so that exported CO2 term here excludes carbon dioxide removed from raw gas and disposed of as an acid gas stream to an underground formation through a class 3 well. And it also adds in CO2 used in the manufacturing of urea. So that kind of sets out our total regulated emissions for the facility. Allowable emissions are those emissions that are, I guess, freely allocated under the program, and those emissions basically include allocations for production. So for each product that has a facility-specific benchmark and/or a high-performance benchmark, you get an allocation for the greater of the FSB or the HPB. And then there are adjustments for imported quantities of heat, hydrogen, or electricity. So the allowable emissions under the program can't be set below 0. The scope adjustment for hydrogen doesn't apply for refiners or upgraders. Exported electricity, heat, or hydrogen should be reported as a product and accounted for in the production term, where the scope adjustments are for imports. And then also cost containment benchmarks, if they existed, would be added to the high performance and the facility specific benchmarks for reporting purposes. In terms of the net emissions and the true-up obligation, so the person responsible for the facility must ensure that the net emissions do not exceed the allowable emissions for the facility by truing up. So the net emissions are basically the total regulated emissions, less the emissions offsets, the emissions performance credits, and the fund credits that are deducted from those total regulated emissions. So again, the requirement is that those net emissions are equal to the allowable emissions for the facility. And so that kind of brings us to our true-up obligation. So really the true-up obligation is the amount by which the total regulated emissions exceed the allowable emissions for the facility. So to the degree that the total regulated emissions are greater than the allowable emissions, that those number of tons of CO2 need to be made up through credit retirement or fund credit purchase. In terms of what has to come to us as part of the compliance package, so we've got the completed compliance form. It's an Excel workbook, the signed statement of certification. So with the introduction of the compliance forms this year, the signed statement of certification can be done within the Excel workbook, which is our preference. Where people have difficulty with that, we'll still be able to accept a scanned PDF if people have trouble producing the electronic signature. The verification report includes the signed statement of verification, right? It includes the signed statement of qualifications and the signed conflict of interest. So that verification report with those signatures has to be submitted as part of the package. The quantification methodology document should be submitted and again updated where necessary to align with the methods that were used and the quantification requirements. An area fugitive report may be required for certain oil sands mining facilities. And then also an emissions reduction plan report would be required for facilities with a cost containment designation. And as discussed briefly before, a confidentiality request could accompany the compliance report if the facility is seeking confidentiality on parts of the reporting. The compliance submission itself should be emailed to our Dropbox here, aep.ghg@gov.ab.ca by June 30th. Payments can be made electronically or by check. If they're coming by check, the address is here, and it should also come, if you're sending a check, please also send the fund credit purchase form, which is the last sheet in the compliance workbook. Electronic payments can be submitted by fund transfer, and the coordinates are here as well as in the compliance reporting standard and the compliance form. In that case, we'd ask that you send your the fund credit purchase form, the last sheet in the book, along or in advance of the electronic payment to the email address here for our revenue team. They'll receive the payment and issue a receipt to the facility, and we'll also get a copy of that for our records. So using credits for compliance, so emissions performance credits or emission offset credits. So those credits need to be put into a pending retirement state on the registry before they're submitted. We would advise actual registry should be submitted 10 days in advance of the compliance deadline, at least, to allow time for the registry to do processing. So the compliance deadline is typically a fairly busy time, so allow some time for your instructions to the registry to execute. EPCs, again, must be retired to the facility that are using them for true-up. So if you're new to tier and you're looking to use emissions performance credits for compliance, you should create an account on the registry, as well as creating a facility under that account for your site. The setup of a facility under the registry also facilitates our ability to issue emissions performance credits to the facility, either for 2020 or for a subsequent compliance reporting. Okay, I'll just take a second and set up. We'll do a short walkthrough of the compliance forms, if you'll bear with me for a second.
Hello, I will provide an overview of the Technology Innovation and Emissions Reduction Compliance Reporting Form for large emitter and opt-in facilities. The Compliance Reporting Form is an Excel book with multiple tabs. Its purpose is to collect historic facility-specific information on greenhouse gas emissions and production that will be used in demonstrating compliance with the requirements of the regulation. We'll take the next few minutes to do a brief walkthrough through each of the tabs from left to right. If your book opens in protected mode, please go to the File Info menu to turn off protected mode. Also, please enable macros for this workbook. So we will start at the Instructions tab. Here we provide a brief summary of the purpose of the book and how to configure and complete it. On the Submissions tab, you may configure this workbook as a compliance or data report. The department will connect with you directly if you are asked to submit a data report for any reason. If you believe information you are supplying on the compliance reporting form meets the threshold to be considered confidential under Section 28 of the regulation, please indicate yes under the drop-down menu and supply a letter with your submission detailing which information meets that threshold and how it qualifies. Information is supplied on this tab about the documents which should accompany your form, as well as record retention requirements. Please note, our preference is that the Statement of Certification tab be signed electronically if possible and submitted as part of the compliance workbook. The next tab is called Section A1. Generally, Section A tabs collect administrative information. A1 contains information about the facility, including the facility name and various identifiers that may apply to the facility. Please note that fields with the red notification tab have associated comments. Hover your mouse over the field to see the additional instruction provided there. Please also supply the first year of commercial operation for the facility. This is the first calendar year following the year in which the facility first produced a product. The next tab, called Section A2, contains fields to provide information on the reporting company and the roles of the reporter who completes and typically submits the form, and the certifying official who is signing off on the contents of the form, as well as the public contact for the facility. The public contact will be used if the department receives questions from the public about elements of the report. Section A3 is a free-form text field in which you can describe any significant changes that have occurred to the facility since prior reporting under previous Alberta regulations. Section A4 is provided to cover a case where the facility has chosen to have an external consultant complete the compliance report. In Section A5, space is given to provide information on facility ownership in cases where the facility has multiple owners. Section B1. The B sections of the form are where emissions and production data are reported. In Section B1, all of the site emissions for CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide are reported, with the exception of CO2 from biomass and emissions from fuel that has had the federal fuel charge paid during a period when you had a federal exemption in place. Report the quantities of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide in tons by source category. The form will capture or will calculate the carbon dioxide equivalents based on the appropriate global warming potentials. Moving to section B2, this sheet is for the reporting of emissions of hydrofluorocarbon on site. Report in tons of each gas type as applicable. Section B3 is for the reporting of perfluorocarbons, NF3 and SF6 emissions. It also includes roll-up of emissions from the last two sheets. Moving to section B4, this section includes some reporting which may not be present at some facilities. This includes reporting of carbon dioxide emissions from the combustion or decomposition of biomass at the top of the page. Reporting of carbon dioxide that is geologically injected within the boundaries of the facility. Carbon dioxide which leaves the facility, for example, in a pipeline or by truck, not including CO2 exported for disposal as acid gas. Carbon dioxide that is brought on site from another regulated facility is also reported, thus any that is imported for the purpose of disposal of acid gas, which is reported in its own field. This section also collects information on electricity, heat, and hydrogen. For electricity and heat, quantities imported and exported from the facility are reported. For hydrogen, in addition to quantities imported and exported, quantities generated, used, and vented or burnt are reported to create a complete balance. The final field in the sheet is for CO2 consumed in the production of urea. Please also note that in reporting quantities of electricity or hydrogen, the mass balance, overall mass balance for the site is checked. Section B5 asks you to list the emission sources that you are treating as negligible. Emissions from these sources still need to be listed, but alternative methods of quantification can be used. These are typically small, difficult to accurately quantify sources. See the embedded comment for details. On treatment and about the cumulative emissions limit for negligible emissions. And to be clear, the negligible emissions still need to be included in your overall emissions as part of the total regulated emissions. The bottom part of the sheet asks if emissions data for this facility is publicly available. Section B6 is for the reporting of production. Please note that the selection of Alberta Gas Processing Index will introduce a supplemental tab to the workbook in order to roll up the throughputs required to calculate the total Alberta Gas Processing Index product. The selection of a product from the pull-down will populate the unit and high-performance benchmark fields. For example, please also introduce your 2020 facility-specific benchmark in column L, as well as the quantity of production in units specified by your benchmark. The form will apply the greater of the high-performance benchmark or the facility-specific benchmark. If you do not have a facility-specific benchmark, column L can be left blank. The total product allocation will be shown toward the bottom of this tab in this box here. There is also a question at the bottom regarding if production is publicly available for the facility. Section B7 summarizes the data that has been supplied for site emissions. No entry is required on this sheet. Section B8 is for reporting of fuels used at the facility either for energy or as feedstock. Please report whether the quantity is fuel or feedstock, the type of fuel, a description, as well as the quantity and units of the fuel that is used. As a reminder, in completing section B, please pay attention to the Alberta greenhouse gas quantification methodology document and what the document requires in terms of methods of quantification for emissions and potentially for production, depending on your nature of production. Moving to section E1. This tab provides an overview of total regulated emissions, allowed emissions, true-up obligation, credit usage limits. It also indicates if the facility may be eligible to request emissions performance credits. Section E2 is where you enter the number of fund credits the facility has purchased and is using for compliance. It also asks to confirm that the person responsible owns the credits and is using them only once. Fund credits need to be purchased in advance of submitting your compliance report and before June 30th. Section E3 is for reporting the emissions offsets that are being used for compliance purposes. Credits are reported by vintage, either pre-2017 or 2017 and later, to ensure that the corresponding usage limits are met. Please list the serial ranges being retired for compliance in this box. Check the ranges carefully, as they are often a source of error in compliance reporting. Also answer the questions at the bottom of the tab regarding the validity of the offsets being used. Section E4 is similar to section E3, where section E4 is for reporting emissions performance credits used for compliance. Again, they're separated into vintage for pre-2017 and 2017 or later. Also pay careful attention in reporting correctly the serial ranges that are being applied for compliance for the year. Section E5 provides an overview of compliance actions and confirms if sufficient true-up has been provided. The assessment in this section takes into account limits on the use of credits by vintage. Please address any issues flagged on this sheet before you submit your compliance report. Section F is a text entry where you can place any comments that are useful for us to understand your submission. It also has a field to report your company website. Moving to section G, this section is to be provided in order to give details about your third-party assurance provider, including who the signing authority is, contact information for the firm, and how they're qualified under the regulations. Section H should be filled out to give contact information for the various roles in the verification team. The next sheet is the conflict of interest checklist. This should be filled out by the verifier and confirms if any of the listed questions are true for the engagement. If so, the verifier should contact the department. A signed copy of this sheet should be included as part of the verification report. The statement of qualifications should be filled out by both the designated signing authority and the lead verifier of the third-party assurance provider, or these are different individuals. It attests to the qualification of the lead verifier and third-party assurance provider, and a signed copy should be included in the verification report. The statement of verification is to be completed by the third-party assurance provider and signed by both the lead verifier and designated signing authority. The signed copy should be included as part of the third-party verification report. The statement of certification is the last tab of the book and should be signed electronically within Excel. To do this, the certifying official will need to set up a certificate. This can be done at no cost through Windows. Double-click on the X within the signature box. A dialog will appear. You may either sign within the box or select an image of your signature. You may also add text under the purpose . If you wish to provide additional information about the signer. The bottom part of the dialog shows who you're signing the document as. The bottom part of the signature here. Further edits to the compliance report will clear the signature. Please do not sign the workbook until it is complete and you are ready to submit it. Again, the statement of certification should be signed by the certifying official. If the facility is requesting emissions performance credits as a result of their compliance filing, this emissions performance credit request form needs to be completed and signed. Please outline the activities or changes in practice that have led to intensity improvements at the facility. Lastly, the Fund Credit Purchase tab should be completed and sent along with your payment to our financial services branch.
Okay.
If you wish, you may make one fund
I'll
payment to
just switch this back. Give me a second. Okay, so that takes us to our final question period of the day. We've got about 15 minutes to work through remaining questions that people might have about the compliance reporting form or the compliance reporting process for this year. We have a couple questions in the hopper, but please feel free if you have remaining questions that you'd like us to cover. We're happy to work through some of those today. So the first question we have currently, if we don't have exemption for on-site fuel and paid federal carbon levy on it, do we include it in tier report under on-site fuel? So again, the direct emissions definition excludes fuels where the federal fuel charge was paid while you had an exemption certificate in place. We expect that would cover things such as, for example, fuel that's used in vehicles that are both on-site and off-site. So for example, if you have service vehicles, trucks, other things that are used both within the facility boundary and outside the facility, and you're using fuel in those vehicles and paying the federal fuel charge on that, you don't have to account for those fuels in your reporting for time periods where you had the federal exemption in place. The next question, in section B6 of the compliance spreadsheet, when using AGPI indexes and the facility-specific benchmark, what is the quantity to be input for the FSB? Is it the exact number as specified in the AEP letter, the Tier 2020 facility-specific benchmark, sent to the facility, or is it the assigned number in the letter times 0.9 to reflect the 10% reduction target for 2020 as specified in the tier regulation? So our FSBs that we've issued for 2020 will already include the 10% reduction requirement. So the FSBs that should be entered in the compliance form are the ones from our letter. The next question is a proposed new large emitter facility that generates electricity from natural gas, which is consumed on site, self-use electricity, considered to be an electrical generation project? Will it be exempt from tier for the first 3 years of commercial operation? Is the fuel gas exempt from the carbon levy during the first 3 years? So we'll just maybe unpack that a little bit. So in general, if the product of the facility is not electricity, I don't think it will meet the definition we have in our regulation of an electricity facility. So the criteria that are in the regulation around the time of compliance reporting, I guess, are consistent with the definition that's in the regulation for what a electricity facility is. So if you're not exporting electricity, I would suggest, or as I recall at least, that wouldn't fall under the definition of an electricity facility under the reg. So it could potentially be exempt from tier for the first 3 years of commercial operation. Even though you're exempted from compliance reporting under tier, if you've opted in to the tier program, you're still covered under tier and can, I guess, have the benefit of the federal fuel charge exemption during those first years of operation. Okay, there's a question here. Maybe I'm not sure or might need more clarification. How is cavern storage treated under tier? So I'm assuming this is, I guess, cavern storage of natural gas or natural gas liquids, what have you. And so I think we have a few instances where we have facility-specific benchmarks that are associated with cavern storage. So I guess if that's the situation for your facility, maybe get in touch with us, and we can look to understand if that should have its own product under tier. And another question here: can renewable energy facilities be regulated under tier, and how will that impact the EPC offset generation? And so renewable electricity facilities, I guess, can and have opted in under tier, and they would generate EPCs based on their total regulated emissions and their allowable emissions, like any other facility. And so I guess those renewable generation facilities would then generate EPCs rather than offsets in that case. Current version of AQM does not provide an emissions factor for compressed natural gas or a factor for to convert CNG volume units to fuel gas units. Does AEP have a recommended method factor for converting CNG volume to fuel as volume? So I guess that's a good question. So if I understand the situation, you have a certain number of units of compressed natural gas, and you're looking to convert those to a fuel volume. I'll maybe see, Maggie, do you have advice here? I mean, I think we also have the ability to use factors from our methodology in energy units. So maybe that's an option.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll mute Maggie.
Pardon me?
I think, Maggie, when I'm unmuted, it's interfering with your audio. So I'll mute and you can go ahead.
Okay, great. We currently don't have emission factors for that, but we will take that back and take a look and see if we can provide any guidance on that.
Okay. Not seeing any other questions. I mean, we can certainly have time here for a few more questions if people have some. Again, if you have other questions that we haven't covered today or a more in-depth situation, please go ahead and email our Dropbox at aep.ghg@gov.ab.ca. Okay, I guess not seeing, oh, we've got one more. For venting of compressor seal, is method 21 used for LDAR expectable? I assume that is to mean acceptable. I don't know, Maggie, do you have an answer for that offhand? I think we've set out in our venting chapter the set of methods to use, but I don't know if you have a specific answer on this one.
Yeah, I can refer you to the specific section for that. I know that LDAR is also used for some of our fugitive emissions, and currently we don't have quantification methodologies for the fugitives yet, but certainly I can direct you to the section of the venting chapter.
Okay, so maybe if you want to just, whoever's asked that question, if you want to stay on, maybe we'll type a response for that in terms of the section. Other than that, I think we'll close out the meeting for today. I appreciate your time and attendance, and again, do let us know if you have questions coming up to the compliance deadline for 2020. Okay, take care.